Nice to see you all this drizzly afternoon.
Yeah, it's drizzly. It's drizzly up northwest, certainly.
Yeah.
I don't know what it's like down south.
Is that your southern accent, Carl?
That was my Northern Ireland southern attempt. Yeah.
Nice to see some new faces and people that we've seen before, repeat visitors.
Great.
Absolutely.
Well, it's just gone 4 o'clock. Shall we get started, folks? Let me begin by just welcoming you properly. Yes, it is. Penny was saying it's great to see people coming back to us. So if you've been with us before, you're just as welcome today as you were before. But also to those of you who are joining us for the first time, perhaps, it's great to see you, and we hope that you have an enjoyable period of time with us. It'll be just around about an hour. We'll be on today. We do tend to keep the time, so do join us for that period. And yeah, we hope that what you get from today is very useful. It's my pleasure to introduce you to my two colleagues. Those of you who have been with us before will be familiar with us all, but both Helen and Penny are sort of doing the main part of the webinar today. So it's great to have them with us. Helen's an experienced practitioner in the impact world, actually. She's worked for some years in the charity sector, but Helen has, I must say, I'll not embarrass her, but she's developed a particular insight into, quite a bit of the range of the methodology, and she brings something fresh all the time to our thinking about impact methodology. And as I say, she's an experienced practitioner, as indeed is Penny Court. Penny has also gathered a lot of experience from the sector, and not least in the work that we've been doing with charities. But Penny has been involved in both running and advising charities, both home and abroad, in fact. So has that wide experience. So I'm delighted that you've got the benefit of both my colleagues today, who'll be taking us through. You will probably know we work for a firm called MKS. So here we are. Next slide, Penny. And we're actually specialised and have won awards in the charity client delivery, if you like. I must say we work very hard to understand the needs of charities, and we find ourselves tackling a range of problems. When we get the slide up, because it looks like we're having a wee bit of...
Sorry, there was technical issues.
Technical turtledom. Here we go. Yes, you can see that it's no accident that we know a little about supporting charities, because of the partners who run our firm. There's quite a range of partners who are specialists in that area. So yeah, we're feel we're pretty well resourced to try and work through some of the issues that charities have. And not least of all is the fact that we've recently, in the last couple of years, have joined the network, a global network. It's we have 609 offices in 112 countries. So again, we've got that sort of international range. But on the next slide, we'll come back down to earth, because here we are. We're a team of 7 actually, and again, you'll be possibly familiar if you've been with us before. But again, we think that this range of skills is a very good thing to help us actually approach and solve the issues that charities have, and not least the, if you like, the blend of both thinking about measuring and managing your impact, but also financial skills, the whole important area of properly reporting, management reporting on costs and cost recovery. And then on the other side, our colleagues from the fundraising side of the work. Again, we think this is an effective blend, which allows us to pull on kind of experience of business models and thinking about the development and sustainability of charities. So let's move on. This is just an encouragement to quote our handle on Twitter and to get talking about the stuff we've been doing. If you cast your mind back to just about a year ago, you'll recall that the world was a very strange place. And one of the things we did while we were scratching our heads to think, what on earth would we do in the sort of midst of an emerging pandemic? One of the things we thought about was just holding conversations. Just let's keep talking. Let's connect and communicate on the issues we're facing. And really, that's how we came to be developing this series of webinars that we've done ever since. So again, if you don't attend all our webinars, well, let's just keep in conversation and keep going. And one of the ways you can keep in contact is through this next slide, where we're really laying out our plans for the upcoming events. You'll see, again, we're continuing the free webinar opportunities. There's a training there which I'd draw your attention to, which is about thinking around strategy. And just as we were talking this time last year about diving in and doing webinars, we've come up with a bright idea of attempting a podcast. So how ultra modern is that? We'll give it a go. So as I say, we'll keep working to see how we can just keep in contact with you all. And please do look at these and see whether or not there's a good opportunity for you here to maybe pick up some information. But anyway, let's get on to the main focus today. The counterfactual. What do we mean by the counterfactual? Well, it's very often thought of as the consideration of what happens in an alternative scenario. And so a lot of you would be familiar with how we use counterfactual stuff in the medical field. So you'll be familiar with, and you'll probably hear the news reports constantly on the subject of what happens when you get the vaccine. And we're still studying the effects and so on. Generally, we know it's great for the vast majority of people, but a very important part of that whole study has been the other bit of the study, the counterfactual bit of the study. What happens when you don't get the jab? So you will probably be aware of, the fact that a number of people in the trials had a placebo. That's studying the counterfactual as part of the whole science measurement. And in the world of impact, it's not a dissimilar approach. We're looking at what happens when you create activity which leads to outcomes. But equally important to understanding that is the bit that what happens to people in terms of outcomes if your intervention wasn't there. So it's studying both those areas, and that's been really important, and we'll demonstrate why that's the case as we go through the subject for today. So my colleagues Penny and Helen will talk about different aspects of what we consider to be alternative scenarios, if you like, dead weight, attribution, duration, and drop off. I'm going to say just a wee bit more about why we should measure these things, and then my colleagues will talk not just about those areas, but actually how you can go about measuring them. So if we move on now, why is the counterfactual important? Well, I have a son who used to run around with his top on it, and it was a music thing. It was about keeping it real, keep music live. So I've kind of adopted this term over the years. It's a reality check. It's about keeping things real. And if we sort of think about the work that we do in our particular field, you'll see that we do tend to claim what we think is happening, and we claim it in total. Now, if you look at these coloured circles, for example, if you separate them from now, so let's just imagine they're two separate circles. The circle on the left would be that thing where we tend to claim the outcome in total. The full green circle represents, let's say, the total outcome. The pink circle, if it was separate and on the right, tends to be what's happening in the rest of the world, despite our own particular work. So it's when you put them together, though, that you see that your influence is something that you create minus external influences. So in other words, the bit of the change that's really down to you is just this green bit on the far left-hand side. And so when we come to think about how do we measure our impact, we're overclaiming, we're overstating our impact if we don't take account of bits of the change that actually aren't down to us. And the truth is, as I've said here in the words, some of the change would happen without us. I know we hate to think this, that these things, that we love to think we're often indispensable, but actually in the world of impact, a number of these things would happen anyway, or if it's not the case that they would happen anyway, if there is really a strong link between what we do in our work and the change that takes place, the fact of the matter is still that some of the outcome is contributed to by external agency. So quite simply, why is counterfactual important? It's because we can't measure the change accurately without taking account of these external factors. I'm just going to finish my introduction to the whole thing by looking at this final slide. And yeah, this is about some of the kind of influences and things that bring about change in our lives. And you'll see in the bottom right-hand side here, there's a myriad of different types of charity and different types of, of work. All these things, if you engage with the work of a charity or you're a beneficiary of a charity, all these things actually work together to actually meet your need in some way. And that's largely what it's about. But that doesn't alter the fact that you're influenced by other agency, if you like, in the world we live in. Perhaps you're a bit like these young women on the left-hand top side here. Are you influenced by people you've grown up with and they have a strong kind of ability to influence your thinking? Or, think about maybe the most important relationship in your life. To what extent are you influenced by someone you're very close to? Not completely, not wholly influenced, but to some extent you're influenced in your attitudes and your decisions and your behaviors. So we need to take this stuff into account. Are you, for example, the type of person who's influenced by officialdom of government messaging? And we've had enough examples of that in the past year. It's almost been if not daily, then a number of times a week. Do you follow the advice? Do you think that's good? This is official. I need to do this, or do you think, yeah, I'll do that, but I'm not so sure about some other aspect. So again, your attitudes are influenced. If you think about what's happening, it occurred to me just in the Middle East in the last week. I did an experiment earlier. I went on to the BBC News and I could see that, there was a particular way of thinking about how I was receiving the news. There's also my subjective bit, my actual view of things before that. But I also went on to the Russian sponsored English news channel RT, and I got a completely different view of the world. And that could have influenced me in a slightly different way. So all this is just to say that we are separate beings. When we think about the change that's influenced by other things, part of it is influenced just by our own attitude, our politics, our view of the world. But there are these other influences as well. And the fact of the matter is, unless we take some of these things into account, at least in some way, then we're not going to be actually getting to the heart of the idea of how much our actions in our everyday work is actually leading to the change, and how much of it is influenced in other ways. Anyway, enough from me. I'm going to hand over to both Helen and Penny. Penny's going to just take us forward by just touching on some of the other reasons why the counterfactual is really important. I'll be around to the end and we may have questions. By the way, if you are thinking about asking questions, you may have asked some already. Could you just please use the Q&A space, and then we'll be able to see them. But thanks, Penny. Thanks, Helen. And I hope you enjoy what we have to present today.
Thanks, Carl. Hi, everyone. So I thought, as Carl said, I'm going to talk through a couple of other reasons why we really sort of feel and believe that measuring this stuff is so important. I'm just going to start by sort of going back to basics and thinking about, what is the reason why we exist as social purpose organizations? What is our main goal, right? And it is, of course, to make a difference, right? To create change, to create positive change in the world, and to make an impact. And not only do we want to do this, but we want to do it really well. And so we need to be regularly reflecting, right? And asking ourselves, how can we do things more efficiently? How can we do things better? How can we create more social value for the people and the communities that we're serving? And that's where impact measurement is absolutely critical, because it really helps to give us the information and the data to make these good decisions that can move us forward. And the counterfactual is a key part of impact measurement. So how does it all really fit in, the counterfactual, what we're talking about today? So here I've got in pink in this rectangle the definition of impact, which is the value of the change that's attributable to you or your organization. And it's the second bit of the equation in the sentence here, really, that we're going to zero in on today, with that the counterfactual helps us to really understand and to measure. So looking at what is it that's actually attributable to you, and not because of these other influences that Carl was talking about. So one of the sort of main reasons really is it can really help us to think strategically about things as organizations. The answer to the first question might be really simple if you think about it, but why would we continue? Why would you continue investing in creating an outcome if it would happen anyway? Or if we don't really know how much of the change we are responsible for. If we are able to understand and are aware of what else is creating change for our stakeholders, it really empowers us to make decisions and to make good decisions and to make better decisions. So I'll give you a quick sort of example to illustrate my point here. It's quite simple, but I think it sort of does get across this idea. So say I had an organization and one of the things, something that I wanted to do was to have a social club and I was looking at sort of working with people that were vulnerable and trying to tackle social isolation, which we know is sort of a major issue in the UK. It has been a major issue anyway, and it's particularly an issue at the moment, social isolation and loneliness. And I may start it up in an area and people are coming to this social club, and there might be some beautiful outcomes that people are experiencing, such as reduced loneliness and isolation. There might be other outcomes like increased dignity or hope about the future. But then on talking to my stakeholders, I might then realize that there are a couple of other clubs in and around the area and other activities that people might go to anyway. So if they weren't coming to my Thursday afternoon club, they would be going to another activity and participating in another activity down the road, and they would be potentially experiencing those outcomes that I've spoken to anyway. So this then calls into question the investment of my resources as an organization, because going back to that question, why would I want to invest in creating this change if it might be happening anyway. And in this particular example, we're talking about dead weight, and we'd say that the dead weight is high, and Helen's going to talk about that in a lot more detail in a bit. But that then is really powerful for me to know, because then I can think, well, I can start making decisions. So should I then take this activity and go elsewhere? So go into an area where there aren't any other social clubs around and where it's really needed. Or perhaps I want to rethink what I'm doing with the resources. So perhaps I don't want to invest in creating those particular outcomes, but there might be other needs and other outcomes that I can create for the stakeholders. So as I said, that's sort of just an example to illustrate the point. And on this next slide here, there's a nice little animation that again looks at how measuring the counterfactual can really help us to maximize our efficiency and to really expand and optimize the social value that we are creating. So, and this ties into Carl's slide earlier, which had the overlapping circles on it. So if we think about the circles on the left-hand side as different organizations and the outcomes that they create, the change that they create. And as you can see that there's a lot of overlap right here. So the areas that aren't overlapping are unique outcomes that those organizations are creating. And then there is quite a lot of overlap, which is often the way that things are actually working. But if we move over to the right-hand side and the image on the right-hand side, which is the squares, it's the same organizations, but they're no longer overlapping. So the same organizations are now investing their resources into creating different changes from one another that complement, so sit by side, but complement one another as opposed to overlapping. And if we superimpose the images onto one another, you can see that the area that's covered by the squares is significantly larger than the area that's covered by the circles. And so this sort of serves to illustrate that the social value is wider, is broader, and we're optimizing the social value in the second image. And this is what we really want to work towards, as individual organizations, but also, as a sector, collaboratively, we want to maximize the change and the social value that we are creating for the people and communities that we're serving. So what we're going to do now is a poll, and it would be great to get everyone involved on this. I'm going to see if it will launch without me having to stop sharing. Can you see that? Nope, there we go.
Yes, that's good.
Great, fantastic. Okay, so we're just gonna give a few seconds and I'll just go through the question and the answers. So the question here is, does your organization have a good understanding of what else contributes to creating change for your stakeholders? And either, yes, you can say we have an excellent handle on this. We really know what else is contributing to change for our stakeholders. You might be sort of in the middle, not really, a bit, so to an extent, but not fully. Or you might really not be engaging in this conversation with your stakeholders and you're really not sure what else is contributing to change in their lives. So just give it a few more seconds and then we'll end the poll and I'll share the results, and then Helen and I will have a quick discussion about what the results are. Okay, so it's coming up to a minute. I'm going to close it now. End polling and share results. Okay, can you see the results, Helen?
Yes, I can. Yes,
Okay.
That's interesting. So we've got about 3/4 of attendees are saying to some extent, but not fully, which is really good actually. And yeah, I think that's really good because it's not necessarily something you see in kind of impact reports a lot, or it's not necessarily formalized, but it's clear that there are these conversations that are happening. And yeah, the fact that 2 people already have an excellent handle on this, again, really, really great. The 19% not really, well, hopefully we'll, by the end of the next half hour or so, we'll have given you a few tools to go away and start having those conversations, and we can kind of help you to kind of shift those categories. But yeah, I think that's actually given me quite a sort of positive, optimistic picture of things, I think. What do you think, Penny?
Yeah, definitely very much agree with you. I think it's great. And I say, hopefully some of the practical things we can talk to that we're going to talk to next will help everyone really. If they have started on this journey of measuring the counterfactual, maybe it'll sort of help refine that so they can do it sort of even more. Okay, I'm going to stop these, Helen, and then I think it's over to you.
Great.
Okay. Just 1 second. Sometimes my computer takes a bit of time to wake up. Doesn't want to go to the next slide right now.
That's all right.
It will. There we go.
Yeah, this is a slide just really pointing out, because Penny has really explained well how kind of strategically advantageous it is to understand the counterfactual. But this slide is really about pointing out that from a kind of technical impact perspective as well, the counterfactual is really important, and there are these 7 principles of social value that Social Value International kind of advocate and have hundreds of members in different networks across the world. And out of the 7, there's one whole principle, which is principle number 5, dedicated to not overclaiming and only claiming the value that your activities are responsible for creating. And I think actually we're probably all familiar with why that's a really important part of impact measurements. There can occasionally be a little bit of a sort of race to the bottom in impact measurement, where there's a trend to want to overclaim so that you get more and more and more funding. And actually, as I say, it's a race to the bottom. It's not necessarily something which in the long run benefits the sector, and it's really much more important to understand what's actually happening as a result of our activities and what's attributable to us. So that's I'd also kind of recommend having a look at those principles if you're interested in impact measurement and you haven't had a look at them yet, because together they do kind of create quite a kind of a good framework of what we would want to see in a good kind of impact measurement practice. And then this slide is really about, it's kind of coming back to what Carl mentioned at the beginning with his sort of vaccine example. So I think most of us, when we're thinking about what would have happened anyway, we probably do start thinking about things like double-blind trials or randomized control trials, some things that are very necessary in kind of medical and scientific interventions. But when it comes to not-for-profit interventions, in many ways are less widespread. Sometimes that may be because of a resources issue. There's also some kind of ethical issues potentially in kind of having these randomized control trials in more kind of social purpose interventions. And what this slide kind of, the message that we really want to drive home with this slide is, just because as a small charity somewhere in the UK or medium-sized charity or whatever your organisation is, just because you're not going to be able to do a randomised control trial, it doesn't mean that interrogating the counterfactual won't provide you with some interesting insights and won't get you close to an estimation of what might happen anyway. And it's really an exercise which is really important, even if you don't have the resources or the time to sort of interrogate it to an absolute maximum level of rigor. It's still, we would really want everyone to be kind of asking this sort of counterfactual type questions if you can within your charity. So enough of all of that, let's actually have a look at these kind of different aspects of the counterfactual. So the first one that I'm going to talk about is dead weight, which has a slightly ominous ring to it, but it's nothing to be too scared of. So the next slide has a very simple definition, and really dead weight is defined as what would have happened anyway. So when we're sitting down with stakeholders in a focus group and we're trying to get to the bottom of dead weight, a classic kind of question that we might ask is, in a world where this activity doesn't exist, what do you think might have happened anyway? This is the scenario that we're trying to get to the bottom of when we're thinking about dead weight. And there's a few different scenarios that might happen. So I've put these 3 charts up here, but they're not by any means exhaustive. There's lots of different things that might happen. But as you can see, it might be that without you, there was absolutely no change that would have occurred. So you're responsible for this massive increase. That's what the first chart's saying. The second chart is saying without you, there would have been some change, but not quite as much, not quite as quickly. And then the second one is about, well, things were going downhill anyway, and our intervention reduced the speed at which that was going downhill or declining or decreasing. So there are these kind of different scenarios and these different types of dead weight that we can think about. But hopefully that gives a little bit more of a kind of shape to what the question is. And then just to kind of, we're using a case study, an imaginary case study of a charity called Run for All, which is an imaginary charity that is basically kind of runs these kind of park run type events for children and their parents up and down the country, just to kind of bring some of our examples to life a little bit. And on the next slide, if we were thinking about doing a theoretical impact study for Run for All, one of the things that we might be able to do is have a little look at benchmarking data to help us try and understand what might have happened anyway. And we've got two sides to this slide here, so I'll just go through each of them fairly quickly. This left-hand side shows Liverpool, which is where I am now, and some of the Northwest. And it uses Public Health England data to look at it's year 6, and it's the prevalence of children in year 6 who are overweight, including obesity. And you can see that the darker red is a very high proportion of kids who are overweight, whereas the lighter colours, so Yorkshire, for example, is a lower proportion of kids who are overweight. And looking at this, we can see that if Run for All did have a number of different events in these different areas of the Northwest, they might be able to see that dead weight would be different in these different areas. So maybe somewhere like Liverpool, there might be higher proportion, i.e. Run for All is responsible for more of the impact, because if it hadn't have been there, then it's more likely that the kids would have been more obese. So this is the way that we can kind of use benchmarking data to try and help us to understand dead weight. On the right hand side, again, it's using sort of big data sets, and both Public Health England and the ONS have lots of different information, and I would definitely recommend having a little explore on their websites at some point, because a lot of it's really good and very accessible, to see if there's anything that's sort of relevant for your organisation. But this is one that I found which is quite interesting and shows the average time spent per day on outdoor sports activities. So you can see for boys it's about 40 minutes, and for girls it's just over 25 minutes. So again, if we're thinking about dead weight and kids who are attending these races, well, if it hadn't have been in a world where they hadn't have been attending these races, actually the boys might have just been spending time outdoors doing other things. But the girls, they're less likely to have done that, and so the dead weight is slightly less for the girls, and that's how we can kind of use these data sets out there to help us to try and kind of understand what the dead weight of our activities might be. And on the next slide, it's nice when there's data sets which kind of match up with your activities and your outcomes, but actually for a lot of the time and a lot of the work that we do, one of the most important and interesting ways that we understand dead weight is through stakeholder engagement, i.e. trying to talk to people about it. And as I mentioned before, we do literally ask stakeholders, ask beneficiaries or members of staff or trustees or people associated with an organisation, what do you think? If this organisation wasn't there, how much of the change do you think might have happened anyway? And as you can imagine, it always strikes off quite an interesting conversation. There's often people who say absolutely none of the change would have happened anyway. But when you start interrogating it, you know, that it's always interesting seeing a group of stakeholders trying to kind of understand and think about what might have happened anyway. And it does sort of strike up some interesting insights. The next aspect of the counterfactual we're going to have a look at is called attribution, slightly less ominous sounding. And the definition is how much of an outcome is occurring because of other organizations or people. So again, using the run for all example, that this might be a pie chart looking at the proportion of a change in maybe confidence or interest in running, and around 60% of that change might have been down to the fact that they're going to these races put on by Run for All, but actually they also go to school and they've got a PE teacher who they get on very well with that year. So some of the change might be down to the school and those classes. And also they have, you know, they're lucky to have supportive parents maybe, and some of the change is also down to the family. So you can kind of see that whereas dead weight, we can maybe have a little look at these kind of data sets and have a little think about it from a kind of research perspective. Attribution tends to be a lot more kind of situation specific. And on the next slide, you can see how we would go about interrogating attribution, and it tends to be basically talking to people, so similar to the dead weight, and we do often use these kind of percentages and the words that go alongside them as well, because it really aids the conversation with people when you're thinking about, well, was it just a little bit of the change that's down to others? And again, attribution throws up some really interesting insights. There's often organizations who find out that there are similar organizations doing things that are similar to them that they might not have known about, or activities that they didn't know about, or maybe there are kind of public services that are happening. And really from a kind of strategic perspective in terms of thinking about partnerships, or as Penny was talking about, efficiency of resources and things like that, attribution is a really, really key area to sort of spark off all of these ideas. And I hope that after this webinar, maybe at least some of you might be kind of inspired to go out and try and start having these conversations, because it really is a very sort of rewarding and insightful part of the work that we do with a lot of organizations.
Thanks, Helen. Okay, I'm back for the last bit here. I'm going to talk about the final two elements on the counterfactual we want to present today, which is duration and drop-off. So duration really is simply how long an outcome lasts for, both during and beyond your intervention. So you know, obviously there are certain outcomes that your activity are sort of responsible for creating that will just occur in the time frame that your stakeholders are with you and participating in that activity. But then there are other outcomes that maybe relate to sort of deeper changes, maybe changes in, say, attitudes or behaviors that may extend beyond the intervention. So when your stakeholders no longer engaging in the activity, they will still be sort of experiencing those outcomes. So sticking with sort of the Run for All example, maybe something like, say, increased fitness or physical health, that might be sort of children who are experiencing that outcome will really just experience it while they are participating in the Run for All events. And beyond that, well, certainly that outcome can't be attributable to the events. But if it's, say, an outcome like Helen mentioned, like a change in attitude, so say a more positive attitude towards running and exercise, well, that would happen during the activity, but may also well sort of endure beyond the activity as well. So different outcomes can have different sort of time periods of duration. And drop-off, we always think about drop-off when we think about duration. They sort of go hand in hand, different, but they work together. And drop-off, the definition is the deterioration of an outcome over time. So we think about this on a scale of 0 to 100%, as we do with attribution and dead weight, and 0% is no drop off, which means that all of the change would still be happening and attributable to your activity, and 100% would be complete drop off. So none of the change is still happening and or is because of your activity. So really, to sort of try and bring this to life so that it makes sense, I'm going to use an example of an outcome here on this next page. So we have an outcome that children experience as a consequent, as a result of participating in Run for All events. They're participating in the event, they begin to enjoy running an exercise, and then that final outcome in the box in blue, this is the final sort of outcome that we would measure, is improved attitude towards running an exercise. So then we move across to the right-hand side, which is the graph. Now on the y-axis, we've got our drop-off from 0 to 100%. And on the x-axis, we've got the time, the duration, right? So it goes from year 1 to year 2 to year 3. And in year 1, we can see that drop-off we've set at 0%, because we're saying that all of the change or all of this outcome is because of Run for All and because the child is attending Run for All events. So that is sort of solely responsible for helping to improve their attitude towards running an exercise, right? Into year 2 now, so this is now going beyond the intervention, but going beyond their participation in the activity. Into year 2, the child starts, say, for example, running with their sibling. So now this new activity that they're taking part in is also now a driving factor in creating the outcome of improved attitude towards running an exercise. And then when we move into, so in year 2, we might say, okay, well, they're still experiencing the outcome, but it's no longer solely attributable to Run for All and the events. It's now attributable also to this other thing they're doing. So we might set drop off at 50%. So the outcome's still occurring, but it's the drop off is 50%. We then move into year 3, and we can see that the drop off is now going to increase even further, because now the child's still running with their family, with their sibling, but they've also now they're now taking part in their school athletics team. So now we've got a number of different things that are contributing to this change, and so that drives up the drop off. And we might set the drop off at, say, 75 or 80%, and only a smaller proportion of that impact of that change can be attributable back to Run for All. And at the end of year 3, we might say, okay, drop off is going to reach 100%, and so we then sort of ring fence that duration at 3 years, and that's what we'd sort of be able to work with and would be able to claim. So practically measuring the stuff again, duration and drop off, as Helen's mentioned, the key way to measure it is to talk to our stakeholders and to ask them, how long do they feel the outcomes last for, and we can discuss duration and then discuss drop off as well. There can be hypothetical questions. So particularly when we're running quite a lot of the work that we do is a forecast analysis. So we're doing like a predictive impact analysis. So the questions are going to be quite hypothetical. So a discussion can be really useful for that. So getting your stakeholders, if you can, getting a select number in a room, in a focus group, and talking through these concepts. As Helen mentioned as well, with dead weight, we can use third-party research. That can be really useful to help us come to an idea of what duration and what drop-off value should be. I just recently completed a forecast analysis for an organization and found that very useful, looking at what other similar studies, so other similar SROI studies that have looked at the impact of activities that was similar to the one that I was looking at, and then looked at their drop-off rates and then could apply that. So that can be really useful. But sort of important to know that it's an estimation, and it's not going to be a linear or perfectly measurable quantity here. We don't have the resource to do that. It's very, very difficult to get that. So it's going to be an estimation. So be comfortable with that, but definitely do try and get an idea. Don't just ignore it altogether. you know, the reality is that the change you're making isn't going to be attributable to you forever. Other things are going to happen. They are going to come into play into the lives of your stakeholders. So we just want to try and get an understanding of what that is. Okay, so that then draws us to the end. I'm going to stop sharing now. And we've left quite a, we sort of planned it to keep a good 15 minutes at the end for questions, as Carl mentioned. So we really would just like to invite you to pop some questions in the Q&A, or if you want to raise your hand and you're brave enough, we would love to hear from you. So please ask questions or share your experience as well. Anything that relates to what we've spoken about today or wider, you know, if you just want to ask questions generally about impact measurement as well, we'd be very happy to answer those. Do we have any questions so far, Helen or Carl?
We do, yes. We've got one from Carl Richardson, actually, which we could probably talk about, especially if people are, I know we've probably thrown quite a lot of terminology and kind of concepts at you. So if you do need a little bit of time to digest, but Carl's got quite an interesting one. He says, I recently had a funding bid rejected by the 4 because I didn't apparently make a case that their funding would make a transformational change. So impact appears to be key to improving that case. Do you agree? I think, I mean, it sounds like that certainly was a kind of one of the reasons why. And we do definitely find that a lot of organizations are interested in impact measurement because a lot of kind of funders are really interested in it. And I think there's definitely become a kind of a bit of a movement towards funders being really interested in what's going to change as a result of what you're doing. So what are the actual outcomes that are going to happen, and what we might call the chain of change. So what's the kind of initial outcomes and what's the kind of causal relationship between them that would result in that kind of that ultimate outcome, and that might cause a kind of transformational change for an organization and therefore the stakeholders. So I think being able to measure impact is really useful because if you've already done that on a number of projects, you've got a bit of a body of evidence. You know, you can say, well, we've done this similar thing before and this is what happened as a result, and therefore we're relatively sure that this is what would happen if we got the funding, for example, or you might be able to predict it based on other evidence out there, but really either way, having some data which links your activity to the change that will arise as a result of it that's attributable to you, trying to bring it back to the webinar today, will be really, really helpful. And that is ultimately impact measurement. So it definitely sounds like that might be a helpful area to explore. Absolutely.
Yeah, I would just add in there, it's quite nice when you've got a scenario in which a potential funder is actually interested in the change you're going to make. So it allows you to use the language, we'll invest in us because this is the outcome that's going to happen. So that idea of social investment in an outcome, it's not a new thing by any stretch of the imagination. But I would say to Carl, it's quite nice, Carl, when you've got that situation where you know what it is you have to do is think about articulating the actual things that your work is going to produce, and someone wants to invest in that is really quite nice. We did a piece of work a couple of years ago for a quite well-known organization that was going for lottery funding, for example, and they didn't get a successful result after the first attempt at lottery, and it was very similar to the story that Carl's articulating here. They wanted to know more about the change that would happen as a result, and they came along to us and we did a study, and yeah, it took a while, it took a year, and but by the time we got hooked up and by the time things got moving and they had funding for the actual study and so on, and the very next year they got a substantial award because the lottery had the complete picture. Now, I'll be frank with you, I don't think there was anything really special in terms of the quality of the work that we did. I think it was the fact that they were able to make this connection where the particular funder was very happy to invest in something that someone had committed to make happen because of the yardstick to actually measure it. And we've got Dan Fletcher with us today, who's one of our fundraising colleagues, for example, introduced you. You'd have seen Dan's picture at the beginning. Dan and the fundraising team, along with the impact team, often work in concert in this particular area. What is your unique selling point? What is it that you're going to achieve? And then do you have a really effective funding strategy to sell that message? And those two things can work very effectively together.
Yeah, and just to kind of close off on that question as well, I've definitely seen more kind of funding applications that are actively asking organizations, are there any other organizations out there who are in a similar space, and in what way are you different? And so having that experience of attribution, for example, where you have spoken to your stakeholders, or you've explored questions about deadweight and attribution, gives you an answer that that is kind of readily available really for that kind of question in a funding application, which is really interesting, because obviously from a funder's point of view, they don't want to give double the money to two organizations who are occupying the same space. So it works in that respect as well.
Right, we have Susan's got a couple of questions. I'll read the first one, and then if anyone wants to dive in, can you expand a bit on using participant feedback to measure attribution? Can you suggest techniques to share the measurement, or demonstration of a change so that this can be recognized by everyone involved, or at least pitfalls to avoid?
This can be a sensitive area. I'll give a really simple example. Years ago, when I was working on a training scheme for people with learning disability, we discovered that a number of the, and they were young people, young adults really, a number of them, they were trained in the area of employability in many ways, but they were also trained as baristas. So their career was always going to be in a cafe setup. And yes, it's true, we had employers lined up to send the qualified person to, and so on. But when we were doing the impact study, we also discovered that some of these young people went off to an evening venue where they also did some employment training. And so there was the question of where does the attribution lie? And Northern Ireland, being Northern Ireland at the time, was coming out of a very competitive sort of era in terms of the voluntary organisations who were, struggling for funding and so on. But someone had the bright idea of just holding a conference. And there were a number of subjects, involved in the conference. But one of the exercises we did was sit down with both the young adults involved and with our own staff team and the staff team from the other agency where they were having additional training. And we actually had, again, Northern Ireland being Northern Ireland with all its issues, actually developed some lovely models in terms of how partnership and cooperation can work. And we actually did work out a system of deciding what percentage of the positive change came about as a result of the primary training and how much was as a result of the second. We looked at the curriculum and we looked at the content, and the nice thing about it was we came to an agreement, whether it was 60 or 40% or whatever, being assigned to each party. I can't remember exactly. But I think the pitfalls that Susan's asking about to avoid are to just guess this or put your finger in the air and hope for some sort of answer. I think the answer to this is to actually discuss and define exactly what the change is about, what has led to the change, and then even roughly some kind of percentage assigned to each agency. And you know, it was an interesting exercise, and also it got us to the answer.
And I
was going to say, go ahead, Helen.
Sorry, I think Susan's asked a connected question after that. So, does using user feedback to assess which interventions have like contributed to an impact and to what degree, does that process need clearer distinctions between who is doing what in a pathway? I think that's a really good point. And when we're thinking about sort of theories of change, or maybe even kind of systems change diagrams about a kind of user pathway and which organizations they kind of come into contact with and which outcomes they might experience within those organizations, I think some of that kind of systems thinking type approach would really help in the kind of conference type scenario that Carl's talking about, where people who kind of all contribute services to the same type of stakeholder would be able to get together and think about how their services kind of overlap and intersect, and how they each kind of contribute to different amounts of impact for users at the same time. I think there have been sort of efforts made in the past to try and use kind of joined up impact measurement across similar organizations. Shared measurements, I think that was what it was called. MPC did a fair amount about it 5 or 6 years ago, and they would try and get say domestic violence services, for example, using similar indicators and similar outcomes measures. And the hope was that by allying these, or kind of by developing these shared frameworks of impact measurement, there might even be a kind of clearer way to attribute impact to different organizations. So I guess that's maybe another way where organizations or services that are collaborating a lot might be able to kind of try and investigate to what extent they share these outcomes and to what extent they're responsible for different parts of them.
Thanks, Helen, for that. We've only a couple of minutes left. There's a last question here from Tony Leach. What about projects that are based on collaboration with other organizations? Good question. It occurs to me, though, this is a scoping question. What I would do with attribution in this case is, I don't think it would apply. What I would do is I would base the study on the way we talk about inputs, outputs, leading to outcomes. The inputs and outputs I would include from both organizations. So if you knew the cost of both organizations in terms of their inputs, if you knew the activities that both organizations were contributing, I would base the impact element on that. So this is a scoping issue, how you actually design the impact measurement in the first place. Attribution still comes into play, but attribution in that case would be influences from agencies that were, again, one step removed outside the organizations that you're thinking of, Tony, here, who are involved in the collaboration. So yeah, it's how you design the actual question and the scoping of the impact piece to begin with, which gives you clarity around what are likely to be external influences. Mm. I hope we've answered your questions. I was just going to say, I heard someone else trying to come in there, but I was just going to say that if when you're reflecting on this stuff, we always encourage you, if something occurs to you, do get in contact with us. We're very open to continuing conversations with you after these events. So don't please be shy. In terms of if something occurs to you and you'd love to explore it or ask us a question, we'll be here for you. Anything to add from my colleagues before we go?
There's one last question if we have time for it. Otherwise, we can always get back to Kat in an email, but she said, thanks for the presentation. It's a pleasure, Kat. Could you speak more about the diagram with the overlapping circles and the squares? My immediate thought was that in terms of impact, programs will always deliver overlapping circles with amplifying impact. And the squares would be great from a funder perspective. But as far as I know, this isn't how it plays out in reality. What are your thoughts? Kat, I think it would be great to continue that chat further, because we probably want to finish up now, but I definitely do agree with you. And I think that is how reality works, in terms of the overlapping, and I guess that's sort of the ultimate ideal. So what we want to be doing is moving towards that. We're never going to get there. It's never going to be everyone perfectly aligned, you know, having perfectly bespoke interventions and outcomes that sit nicely together, but we can try and improve. That was the point, like moving towards that, improving. And in order to do that, measuring the counterfactual and try and separate those circles as much as we can. Okay, lovely. Thanks for that, Penny. And Kat, maybe Penny will get in contact with you to continue that conversation. That's it. It's just literally 1 minute past 5. We've failed. We're over time. But just to say thank you very much for joining us. I hope you've got something out of it, and do keep in touch. Do enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you.
Thanks,
fill out the feedback form as well if you can.
Oh yes, yeah, that should flash up now. So please feed us back.
Bye.
Bye for now.